Welcome to everyone online and in the room, even if we can't see you. My name is Edgar Taylor. I'm a lecturer in the Department of History, Archaeology, and Heritage Studies. We're very pleased to welcome you to today's seminar because we have our colleague, Dr. Pamela Khanakwa, presenting on an extremely important and timely topic, both particularly within, in reference to our own department, but also I think in the profession of history more broadly. So we just a few words in advance before we get started and I make the introductions for everyone online. Our usual format is that everyone has the speaker will have about anywhere from 45 to 60 minutes to present. We then have our discussant, Dr. Benedito Machava from Yale University, who will offer some questions and comments for about 5 to 10 minutes. And then the floor will be open to the audience. If you could just remain muted until the question and answer portion, so there are no interruptions. And if you have a question, either type it in the chat or use the raise hand button. And just a note for those in the room, this is a bit different this week because of the internet situation. We can't see you on the camera from behind. So if when you have a question, just identify yourself so everyone knows who you are. But as I said, it's our pleasure to welcome you to this particular seminar. Dr. Khanakwa as I said, is now a senior lecturer in the department, the first senior lecturer in quite a while for the department, which is I think a reflection of the sort of optimism and growth of the department that she's will be speaking about. She's the author of numerous articles, most recently in African Studies Review, Cattle Rustling and Competing Land Claims. She has numerous other articles in the Journal of African History, chapters in edited volumes doing conceptual history in Africa, co-edited by, I see Rhiannon Stevens in the audience, welcome. And most recently in edited volume by Dominique DePio, Moving Back into the Future, Critical Recovering of Africa's Cultural Heritage, and has many roles and in the department and the university as a advisor, mentor, teacher, and many other contributions. Our discussant is, as I mentioned, is Dr. Benedito Machava from Yale University, who is a assistant professor in the Department of History at Yale and has written extensively on decolonization, liberation struggles, histories of also public morality, of carcerality and punishment and citizenship in Mozambique, and is working on a book manuscript, The Morality of Revolution, Re-Education Camps and the Carceral Regime in Socialist Mozambique, 1974 to 1990. So we'll look forward to his comments after the presentation. So with that, I would just like to hand over the floor to Dr. Khanakwa for the presentation. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Okay, thank you very much, Edgar, for that very generous introduction. And thank you, Benedito, for accepting to read my very rough, I must say very rough piece of work. I just, and of course, I would like to welcome everybody to this presentation. I don't take it for granted that you set aside whatever you're doing to listening to me. Just very briefly, I want to say that this paper is a product of research that I've been doing over the last about 2 years or so. And it was generously funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation through the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Makerere University. So we have this big project of historicizing the humanities, in which we're all writing histories of the different humanities and humanistic disciplines at Makerere since the 1922. And so, I would just like to make it clear that I'm kind of working with a lot of information, and I would like to apologize in advance that some of the section might seem disjointed because, again, I continue to think through the work and see the best ways in which I can try to pull ends together. The other point also that I would like to ask the audience to bear with me is that I kind of straddle between history at Makerere University, but also try to pay attention to what was taking place beyond Makerere University in the field of African history, and how this influenced developments at Makerere. So I'll do a bit of cycling back and forth at Makerere, and then talk about perhaps what is going on in London or in the US, and coming back here and there. So I really ask you to bear with me, and perhaps ask you to fasten your seatbelts so that I can be able to run through this. Again, I would also like to apologize about my slides because they may not capture everything. Sort of rough work. I don't like speaking to slides, but then I realized that for such a blended meeting, it helps maybe when you have slides, even if they might not be very well organized. So without further ado, I'd like to say that, so in this paper, I begin by looking at the developments leading to the establishment of African history, not just at Makerere, but beginning from SOAS, because that became the basis from which African history, especially in the Eastern Africa, sort of leaned on the developments at SOAS. So I look at the period of the 50s and look at what was happening in London and what was happening at Makerere. Then I look at the publications coming up in the early 60s, especially the initial History of Africa project, which was funded by the Colonial Welfare Office, and which focused really on colonial histories. And so from the mid 1960s, we see an emergence of a nationalist history. So I draw on that and look at the developments up to the early 70s, and then jump to the post-Idi Amin period and look at the kind of histories that attracted the attention of the scholars at the time. And I hope then I can have the time to also look at the 90s, when we get into the neoliberal era, and how that shapes the field of history at Makerere University, and conclude on the point of where we stand today as a department. So I need someone, I need someone to show me how to move the slides on this computer, because I'm not very familiar with it. So I was hoping that I'll just, yeah. So I can see that up there. Okay, so yes, of course, most of us know that Makerere was established in 1920. But it was not until the 1940s that we have more humanities disciplines and history in particular introduced. In that initially the courses were largely European oriented. And so the premise here being that, of course, Africa had no history. There was, this Western supposition that Africa had no history. It was all a dark continent with no history to boast of. And so in introducing European history at Makerere in the 40s, this was to provide a sort of space through which European hegemony and Western civilization would be spread. So I apologize. Okay, sorry. Okay, all right. Okay, and so I thought that one of the important moments to talk about is 1949, and I thought 1949 was particularly important in the history of Makerere, because that is when Makerere entered a special relationship with the University of London. And among other things, it was the University of London to approve the teaching syllabi, the examinations. It was the one to award degrees. It was the one to recruit staff who would teach at Makerere University. And this is important because, as we'll see, it meant that authorities at Makerere on their own could not determine what they taught if this was not okayed by the University of London. And so during that period, what we see is that, yes, there is no African history taught, but that is not to suggest that there wasn't any form of historical knowledge production in Uganda. Again, those familiar with the works of historians of Uganda will be familiar with the works of Sir Pamela Khanakwa, who had written much earlier in the century. And in addition, I also would like to add that in the 1940s, the Faculty of Arts at Makerere introduced a prize. And so they called it the Arts Research Prize, which was introduced in 1946. And so usually students who, it was competitive. And so the winning essays would get that prize. And so undergraduate students, largely Kenyans, participated in that competition, and they won the prizes. So I have three names, and all these undergraduate students then were Kenyans, but we can see that from their topics, or from the topics that they worked on, they were developing a sort of social or cultural history at a time when African history was not yet taught at Makerere University. And so I think it's a clear indication here that even without formal teaching, the students and undergraduates in particular at that time were able to generate ideas and write around aspects of social history. And so broadly speaking, by the 1940s, there wasn't anywhere in the world where an institution that specifically focused on African history was established. Even SOAS that had been established in 1917 initially focused on instructions in languages and cultures. Of course, this was during the World War I, and I don't want to go that direction too much. But after World War II, the colonial powers then realized that, and I'll ask you to allow me read this, that the post-war world would demand a fairly speedy end to former empires and that future relations between Europe and the third world would need to be conducted on the basis of much more knowledge and respect for Asian and African civilizations and cultures. And so this then provided the context within which the Interdepartmental Commission of Inquiry was recommended, that is in 1946, to create specialists to work on various regions, especially in Africa and Asia. And so what happens then at SOAS is that they begin to recruit young graduates in different academic disciplines. And so that is how renowned historian Roland Oliver comes into the picture. And as I'll show later, he becomes very influential in the development of African history at Makerere University, and even more specifically, sort of emphasis on tribal histories. So Oliver was hired in 1948 at SOAS, and his supervisor at that time emphasized that the young graduates would have to travel to the areas that would eventually become points of their specialization and acquaint themselves with the languages, but also with what was going on in those places. So in that regard, then in 1949, Roland Oliver made his maiden visit to East Africa, and of course, by extension to Uganda. And in Uganda, of course, he came to Makerere University, where there was no department of history, but the subject was being taught part-time, as I already mentioned. And while here at Makerere, he was introduced to the principal at that time. The principal was Professor Bernard de Benson, not the one who invented the Benson banner. This was Professor Bernard de Benson. He was a professor of education and acting principal of Makerere at that time. So de Benson offered Roland Oliver a teaching position and sort of tried to persuade him to take up this position at Makerere so that he could establish a department of history. But Roland Oliver declined, and in his work, he makes it clear that he was particularly not very keen on working in a teaching department. His assumption was that for a new institution like Makerere at that time and a new department of history, such a department was going to focus on teaching and not on research and writing. But Oliver was interested in research and writing, so he declined that position. He also thought that the best scholarship, I mean, this is way back in 1949, but I believe that the best scholarship on African history would be, should be initiated from outside the continent. And as I quote him there, for many years to come, the best books on African history will be written not here, but in England. And the same probably goes for most of serious academic work by African students. I don't know what to say about this, but I mean, the point is that why did he think so? And I think that, I mean, at that time, the facilities had not been developed here sufficiently developed here at Makerere, I guess, to support such kind of work. But I'm also still trying to interrogate this further, the idea that we would be a teaching university, a teaching department, and not one that focuses on research and writing. And I think that, yes, again, I would invite all of us here to reflect on this and see whether we have moved very far from Oliver's assumptions in 1949 or not. So, so when Oliver declined, De Bansen had to find somebody else to teach or to take up history. And so later we see that Makerere hires Kenneth Ingham, who actually came and established the department. But so that was in 1950. But at the same time, De Bansen also persuaded Oliver to write a paper to the academic board, at Makerere, to sort of provide ideas of how he thought the new department would be developed at Makerere. So this paper was discussed at the board, where Oliver actually attended. And among other things, of course, he argued that African history, I mean, it was important for Makerere to not only introduce African history, but also make it a major subject of study. And he thought that this would not be possible if, again, Makerere did not pay attention to the importance of research. And so he cautioned, as I'd like to quote him here again, the future emergence of textbooks worthy of university studies would depend greatly upon speedy collection and preservation of the wealth of historical evidence that was still in an oral state, and that was nowadays being passed on sporadically from the older to the young generation. So Oliver was able to make this kind of recommendation, but also caution, because before De Bansen asked him to write this paper, he had actually gone around different parts of Uganda, trying to collect some oral histories. And he had also gone to and used the archives in Entebbe. So in his field trips going to different parts of the country, I think that's how then he gets concerned about the state of the information that was still in oral form, and therefore the need, or therefore suggests the need that the university needed to act so that we can have a collection of such information happen very fast. So in that regard, he recommended that the university recruits at least 1 or 2 African members of staff with the linguistic skills to devote their research effort to such work. And he also recommended, and I thought this was very interesting, that Makerere sends potential candidates overseas for professional training in history. So it was not only, in other words, it was not only the production of historical books that would take place outside Makerere, but also the place to train historians, in his view, was somewhere else, but not here. So during the meeting with the board, of course, who are all European members, Oliver says he noticed that they were primarily concerned with implanting European culture in Africa. They seemed a bit reluctant to accept Oliver's views. So again, I skipped the details there, but at the end of it all, his paper was accepted, and it was proposed that it should be implemented as soon as possible. But he also makes it clear himself that his paper was accepted because of Principal De Bansen's support during the meeting. And so later that year, Oliver went back to London, where he had to confront the question of African history. Again, as he writes himself, I had to address the much wider question of how African history should be developed into a singular subject of study, not only in London, but also in the emerging university colleges in tropical Africa that were preparing their students for London University degrees under the system of spatial relationship. So back in London, he introduced the weekly African seminar, and this brought together staff at SOAS to talk about possible ways of reconstructing African history. And one of the things that had begun to emerge at that time was the talk around using oral tradition and oral histories. And so while that was going on, while the weekly seminar was going on, he developed the idea, something that they worked together with historian Jay Fage, and thought that they needed, that he needed to expand this conversation between the confines of SOAS. And so they organized the first African History and Archaeology Conference in 1953, at which, of course, again, the discussion was about the field of African history. Among other things, there was a proposal that a research institute should be established. And so this only happened after about 5 years, when the British School of History and Archaeology was established. Of course, that one later took on the name, the British Institute in Eastern Africa. And I know that many historians, and including students at Makerere University, especially back in the 60s and 70s, even 80s, they had the student attachment, or in one way or the other, they worked with the British Institute in Eastern Africa. So this institute still remains a big partner in the field of African history and archaeology. So this conference, the most interesting thing I think about this conference, I mean, everything is interesting, but I think that one of the really outstanding things about the 1953 conference was that the colonial correspondent in the London Times produced an editorial, which was titled Africa's Past. And so here he reflected on the discussions at the conference. And so he observed that these discussions raised the question whether the somber picture of darkness and ignorance pervading the African continent before the coming of the white man is not largely due to our own failure to unearth the past. So this is something that comes up in the London Times, and I think this clearly was a sort of response to the category of people that dismissed African history as, Africa not having a history because it was essentially a dark continent. But for those interested in promoting African history, this was important because then they felt that that editorial placed African history on the map, therefore attracting attention. So so that happened at the conference. And back at Makerere now, I did say that the paper was there was the discussion of the paper by discussion of Roland Oliver's paper. So yes, of course, the Senate had accepted the paper, and now it was Kenneth Ingham who had to actualize the proposals in that paper. And so in 1951, he introduced History of Tropical Africa. This was to add on already the European-oriented curriculum that I referred to. But at that time, the department faced two major problems. Of course, again, being a newly established department, there were no textbooks, and also there was inadequate staff. So they needed to find solutions to this. And so in 1952, at the East African Governors Conference, the governments of Uganda and Tanganyika, again with support from the Colonial Social Science Research Council, agreed that they would support the production of 2 volumes of History of East Africa. The idea actually was that these books would then become the textbooks that the universities and perhaps even some of the secondary schools would use. And as we will see again, yes, the proposal is made, the funds are provided, but again, we all know that books cannot be produced overnight. So it was not until the early 60s that these books actually are produced. So in the meantime, in the department, there was more recruitment of staff, and these different members of staff used government archives to write colonial histories of Africa. So basically, at this time, the kind of history being written by people teaching, working at Makerere, was a colonial history that focused on the activities of Europeans within the East African region. But at the same time, there was effort to increase the African courses in the curriculum, and so by 1950 we see that there are more African courses in the department. Now, so I'd like to cross over to the other side again and say that after the 1953 conference in London, again, the organizers thought that they needed to consolidate what the gains of the conference. And so they organized another conference in 1957, which was attended by 100 people, and I sort of give a bit of breakdown. I think the really interesting thing here is that people who were teaching in university colleges in British or Anglophone Africa did attend, and Makerere was represented at that conference. Now, one of the key issues emerging from this conference was the discussion around what would constitute African history. And I think the understanding was that this would be history that is African-centered. They also agreed that doctoral students who wanted to study African history would focus indeed on African history or do an African-centered history and not focus on European activities or colonial policies. At the same time, it was also highlighted that those focusing on documentary research should use both the local and the metropolitan archives. And I think the point here is that during Oliver's visit to Uganda in 1950, when he went to the archives in Entebbe, he established that the records relating to the first 10 years of colonial rule were actually missing, but that those of the 20th century were intact. And so to sort of avoid that gap where information is incomplete, if one is, if one just used one particular set of archive, the conference came up with this suggestion. At the same conference, again, people teaching African history, especially from the university colleges in Anglophone Africa, mentioned the problem of textbooks. Remember that, yes, the proposal had to develop a project to publish books had come up in 1952, but by 1957, these books were not yet out. So the people who were teaching still had that problem. So again, they were given a reassurance here that the funds had been provided and that Oxford would be able to publish these books. And I think it is here that they actually then spelled out the details of what each of the books would focus on, the different volumes of those books. Again, I want to imagine that those of us who have taught African history are familiar with these volumes. I'll come back to them shortly. Another important thing about that conference is that, again, this is where the proposal to have a journal dedicated to African history for both archaeologists and historians to share research was, this is where the proposal came up. And so, after that, Oliver and John Fage had negotiated with the Rockefeller Foundation for a grant that later enabled them to launch the Journal of African History. I think the most prestigious journal in the field of African history. And so again, this is important because later when we see in the 60s historians at Makerere, and even in the years after that, when they write, are they able to publish in the Journal of African History? Are they able to speak to debates there or not? Okay, so after the conference, what we see happening is a number of publications coming up. In 1958, Ingham publishes his making of modern Uganda. Of course, one can say that, you know, the conference is 1957 and the publication comes out in 1958. So maybe there wasn't so much to change his ideas. And so this is a book that largely focuses on colonial history or British administration, specifically in Uganda. He also went on to write another article on using local sources. Other historians in Makerere at the time also continued to use archival sources to produce different forms of colonial histories relating to the East African region. The other thing that happens after the conference, and that was particularly important for Makerere, I think, was that in 1958, Bethel Ogot, again, this is a name that all students of history of East Africa must be familiar with. He got a Rockefeller Foundation Fellowship to do a PhD. So he's the first alumnus of Makerere to get funding to do a PhD, specifically in African history. And this was at SOAS, which basically meant that he was going to work with Roland Oliver. So he focused on the migration and settlement of the Luo in Eastern Uganda, Western Kenya, and he was, you know, largely drawing on oral evidence. So Oliver says that he thought that this was he was ready to support Ogot, and he did support them. But initially he thought that this was a high-risk venture because at the end, again, as I quote, examiners appointed by the Board of Studies in History might say that, however impressive, the result was not history as the board understood it. And so it was not history because they would not double check the sources. There were no written sources. How were they going to double check oral information that Ogot will have collected from Uganda? So there was that kind of debate. But nonetheless, Ogot completed the program. He returned to Makerere, where he worked briefly before he relocated to Nairobi. Okay, so the important thing here about Ogot getting a Rockefeller Foundation for me was to kind of draw now the link between Rockefeller Foundation and African history, what was happening. Because then it seems clear that Rockefeller Foundation was interested in promoting history, especially of course, this is late colonial period, for the new nations, so that they could secure a sense of national identity. And so I apologize on my slide. I'm saying 1965, that should be 1962. So in 1962, Oliver went on a tour visiting universities in the United States. And among others, he visited Northwestern University in Evanston. You can guess why I'm mentioning that. And while he was there, he visited the Rockefeller in New York. So here, the Rockefeller officials asked for his views on the course of research and training in African history, you know, in the coming years, both in Africa and outside Africa. They asked him to identify historians who could help develop or build the departments of history at African universities. And so his view was that African or universities in Africa needed to place African history at the center stage of historical education, just as American history was in the US universities. And he had a sense that this was actually already accepted in Anglophone universities. You know, people were willing to have African history at the center of their education. But the problem is that there were no teachers with the necessary skills to implement this. And so he suggested that Rockefeller Foundation would support African universities, or even support the development of African universities in the continent by encouraging a few research training centers. And so he pointed, of course, Wisconsin, UCLA, so that Rockefeller would help such centers in ways that would enable them attract research students from Africa. This was really largely through fellowships, so that, you know, people are attracted to go and study African history, and that way they can return to Africa and take care of this gap of the gap, or address the problem of the manpower need. So we can see here again, this is 1962, and I think that Roland Oliver's position remained the same. The power centers of both training and knowledge production were to remain in the north. So the Africans would go there, drink from the pots of wisdom, and return to Africa to teach. And so I picked this quotation because I thought it was very interesting, where Oliver writes, when he was reflecting on his visit to Rockefeller Foundation, he says, the significance of the visit of my story is simply that whereas in 1948, I had been a lone voice crying the cause of African history in the wilderness, here I was in 1962 on the 42nd floor of the Rockefeller Foundation building, discussing a strategy for the development of African history on the 3 continents with a group of highly intelligent people with the resources to greatly influence academic decisions throughout the world. These were people who had already helped me with the launching of the Journal of African History, who had provided Alan Ogot with a fellowship to carry out his pioneering study of oral traditions among the Luo. I left them with the optimistic feeling that the current initiative would turn out to be much more than the gleam in the eye. So I think, so really I picked out this long quotation just to highlight the interest of Rockefeller Foundation, but also the role that Roland Oliver plays as a sort of, for lack of a better word, a sort of go-between, where, you know, we have the African universities here that have the manpower need, they don't have resources. You have Rockefeller Foundation there with a lot of money and also interested in promoting African history. And here is the person that they can consult for advice and guidance to that. And so after his visit to the US, Oliver returned to London, and that is the time when Matias Emakula Kiwanuka, again, who had also been a student at Makerere, graduating with his BA in 1962, now enrolled for PhD studies at SOAS, and he also went and worked with Roland Oliver. Later in 1966, Karujire also enrolled for PhD studies at SOAS, and he also worked under Roland Oliver. So, so that was happening there. And back here on the continent or in the East African region, what happens in the early 60s is we see the emergence of the History of East Africa publication. I don't know why they agreed on that one name, because Ingham publishes his History of East Africa in 1962, which was very, very much criticized. I think that one of the people said that it was a book for students to pass exams, but it was not scholarly at all. You know, a bit of criticism there. And the main point being that this book seemed to focus on it paid no attention to the pre-European period in East Africa. So we had one, Majuma, I think he was Tanzanian, who was in Uganda at that time. And in his observation, he said that African readers of that book would be very disappointed because they will not be reading African history. They will be reading a history of Europe in Africa. And so in his view, African history of East Africa still remained to be written. So the biggest complaint here is that Ingham seems to have ignored the emerging developments in the historiography of Africa, especially following the 1957 conference and the emphasis on having an African-centered history. So in 1963, the first volume of the History of East Africa, edited by Roland Oliver and Matthew, was published, and it covered the period between the Stone Age to the eve of independence. There are many things there, but it was applauded by Jan van Sina because he thought the authors at least tried to provide original data. Of course, there were also criticisms of the same book. But one important thing for me from that book is that it did provide, at least for a shift, a sort of shift in methodology to incorporate oral traditions, although the oral traditions talked about at this time were those that had been recorded in the publications of missionaries and European explorers. Okay, so we have the publications coming out, and then 1963, we have the University of East Africa being inaugurated. So some people here, especially the young people, don't know that Makerere at one time was referred to as the University of East Africa. So one of the objectives of the new university was to preserve, transmit, and increase knowledge production so as to enhance intellectual life and cultural development in East Africa. At the same time, they were also concerned that the curriculum needed to be decolonized. So I pick a quotation here from Hilary Ngweno, who was an editor with the Daily Nation in Kenya, who said, the University of East Africa can ill afford the luxury of teaching such subjects as Latin, Greek, British Empire history, the economic history of Britain, and a host of other subjects which are considered indispensable in the academic curricula of British universities. What appears necessary is a revision of heavy Britishness, if I may call it, of our educational system. So these concerns about decolonization appear at that time. I'll skip this slide. And so in this period of sort of heightened nationalism in the early 60s, and this calls for decolonizing the history curriculum, there are also other issues that emerge in Uganda at that time. Of course, now we are at the post-independence period. So particularly in Uganda, for example, there was the issue or the controversy over the lost counties. And a lot was going on. And so what we see is Kiwanuka, who had now acquired or attained his PhD from SOAS and returned to Makerere in the department in 1965, introduced a course on Uganda and her neighbors. again, this is in the context of the debates around the lost counties. And he wrote, he's published quite a number of papers in the second part of the 60s that largely centered on the history of Bunyoro Kitara. And, he tried to revisit a few things and faulted, the European writers for misrepresenting the power and strength of Bunyoro Kitara. Actually, in his view, such writers had exaggerated the strength of Bunyoro Kitara at that time. And again, I'll try to skip this, but the main point is that he argued that this whole notion of the empire of Bunyoro Kitara was a myth, and that it had been perpetuated because the European authors had only relied on traditions from Bunyoro. So for him, he thought that to remedy the situation and perhaps have a more balanced history, people needed to focus on tribal histories that would embrace or focus on the entire population and not simply think about the ruling clans, as had been the case in the historiography of Bunyoro. Of course, here again, there was a background to that, and one of the aspects that perhaps I can highlight here is that earlier Roland Oliver had mentioned that perhaps he produced a chapter in the history of East Africa that was published in 1963, and he had mentioned that perhaps it was possible to work with traditions, especially for the centralized societies, because they were more organized. But then for the decentralized societies, that was he was skeptical about that. And I think what Kionika was saying here is that perhaps you need to pay attention to the entire population and not simply take these traditions that you collect from the royal courts. And so again, so I'll skip Kiwanuka because of time and jump to 1968 when Martin Webster joined Makerere in the Department of History. And again, the interesting thing for me here is that Webster was also a former student of Roland Oliver. And so he came to Makerere from the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, where by that time the Ibadan School of History was firmly established. In fact, when they had the conference in 1957, I think Ibadan was the only college from the continent that was represented by Africans, because Nigeria was way ahead of us. By then they already had people like Ikime, Kenneth Dike, who had already attained their PhDs and they were back teaching on the continent. So under Webster, what do we see? A history seminar was established, and this was directed by Nigerian historian Uzoigwe. And a collection of papers from this seminar led to the publication of a special issue of Tariq in 1970. So in this issue, the authors, and Karujire, by the way, was one of them, grappled with the dilemma facing African history that they thought had been contaminated from the source. In other words, African history had been contaminated from the source. And so Uzoigwe proposed, if we are to train future historians dedicated to the study of Africa's past, the right approach must be initiated at secondary or even at primary level. And I think that my colleagues here in the department might want to agree with me on this one, because these are issues that we still grapple with today. But this was important because it began as a history seminar. I think sort of emulating Roland Oliver's African history seminar at SOAS, and that the papers presented this really engaged with debates in the field at the time, leading to the special issue of Tariq in that year. Now, the other important thing about Webster's period is that he launched what was called the History of Uganda project. And there are many interesting things about this History of Uganda project, but one thing that stands out for me is the source of funding, where the money was coming from. So there was Makerere Research and Publication Grants Committee, and then Rockefeller Foundation and Ford Foundation that provided funding for this project. And so what we see here is a focus on histories of decentralized societies, including, among others, the Iteso, the Lugbar, Labor, and Acholi. Some of these projects were concluded, and we see publications coming up. Some of them were disrupted by the Amins coming to power and the sort of intellectual suffocation that followed that. But important also to note is that at that time, by the time Webster is at Makerere, history had the highest number of graduate students, some of them local and others foreign students. So there was every hope. In Webster's view, he thought that there were, apart from SOAS and perhaps Wisconsin, that he could not think of any other university that was better placed to train African historians than Makerere University. So don't ask me what happened after that. But reading through his archives, it comes out clearly that following, there was the Amin school, but there were also internal issues at Makerere, and he thought that the environment was not very supportive. So he shared his disappointment with Coleman of Rockefeller Foundation. Remember, Rockefeller Foundation was supporting the project, and this is what he wrote. Obviously, research doesn't matter. We must continue merely as a glorified secondary school or factory, where our main responsibility is to stuff facts and figures into more and more undergraduates' heads. Is this college to become a university or not? Again, I cut that quotation short, but I think that this speaks volumes. And the other problem that he raised was questions of who gets incorporated into the history of Uganda project. So he said that some Ugandans had this sense of entitlement, even when their own work was found lacking. So there are issues around that. And so eventually Webster left. Webster left while there was still, all these other pending issues. But of course, again, the Idi Amin regime had made situations a little bit complicated. So I also just note that yes, in the early 70s, we have publications coming up. Again, Karugire's history of the Western Kore, and then Semakula Kiwanuka's history of Uganda from the earliest times. These books that were developed out of their PhD dissertations, and indeed they constituted huge historiographical milestones in the case of Uganda. At the level of curriculum, there were debates in the 70s, and I found this very interesting. Some of the students in history were opposed to anything to do with European history, and specifically, one of the students argued, and this was in one of the newsletters, that British constitutional history should be abolished from the secondary school curriculum in Uganda. But here at Makerere, the Senate disliked the fact that history department was concentrating too much on African history. So for them, I think their interest, and so this is after Makerere has become an independent university in 1970. And the independent university is complaining about too much African history. And this kind of demands did, I think, compel Semakula Kiwanuka, who took over headship from Webster to reintroduce more European courses at Makerere. So I don't know what I did. It's not the end of slideshow. So I need some technical support here to get back to my slides. What are these messages? Okay, let's see. I hope they're all uploaded. I don't know. So you just have to, okay. So I'm going to scroll down, first put in slide. I'm sorry about that. Go, let's go again. Very far again. Okay, I think it just, what did you say? I don't know, but I think I'll just go to the original text if, because of switching computers, if. No, that one, that is way too far. I'll just go to, I'll go to the, no, go up again. Just wait, it's still ahead. Okay. Let's see. No, I think that was done. Where? Okay, I apologize. Okay. Okay, so I think it's okay. You can leave it there. Thank you. So, and I hope that, okay. So I think I transferred my, it's okay. It's okay. So because I transferred my slides, but I think that some were not picked on here. But okay, I can continue from here. So I want to leave the early 1970s there with Webster leaving and the Makerere sort of Senate demanding that they wanted more European history than African history. And fast forward to the late 1970s, from about 1979, where we see a different sort of historiography emerging. And here we see historians, Semakula Kiwanuka himself writes on the dread, terror, and oppression in Amin's Uganda, that is 1979. And then in 1980, of course, we have Karugire's political history of Uganda, and information leading to the publication of Karugire's book had been collected way before the Amin coup in 1971. And so in this book, we see that Karugire was very disappointed with the oppressive nature of the post-colonial state. And he very strongly criticized Obote's regime and how Obote's government bent laws to suit individual citizens while ignoring the public outcry. I want to quote him here when he says, the period between May 1966 and January 1961 was a very uneasy one indeed in Uganda. From then, the country had a civilian administration which employed military methods and means to implement whatever policies they chose. If you look towards the end of that book, he was a little bit, optimistic. He pointed that when Amin came to power, this provided for some sort of optimism, but guarded optimism for Karugire. And so he said, again here, whether or not the army would right the injustices listed in the 18 points, and whether or not the rejoicing at the fall of Obote was yet another premature triumph of hope over experience. that only time would tell. So this he had written about the Amin coup when Amin came to power in 1971. That perhaps time would tell whether Ugandans had celebrated prematurely or whether that celebration of the end of Obote's rule was actually something to celebrate. And he dedicated this particular book to all Ugandans, men and women, old and young, whose efforts were, are, and will continue to be geared towards making Uganda a happy country for everyone to live in. So this is his publication of 1980. In 1988, Karugire again published another book, Roots of Instability. And among other things, in this book, he asserted that from April 1964, when a contingent of a fearsome paramilitary section of the Ugandan police invaded Nakurabye, a suburb of Kampala, and killed several people and injured others, the people of Uganda have never known any real peace and have had a succession of insufferable governments, each appearing anxious to outdo its predecessor in brutalizing its people. This is what Karugire writes. He wrote actually this book. He wrote that in 1986. And the book came out in 1988. So he was largely drawing on his personal experience to reflect on the political disorder and the social chaos, if you want, in post-independence Uganda. And like all historians, he confessed that this is not an objective study of Uganda's recent history. I have lived through some of the events that I'm about to narrate, and in some, I have been a minor participant. I have been an interested observer, and in all of them, I am a Ugandan. So I'm sorry that I'm quoting Karugire at length, but I thought that in terms of thinking about history as a discipline, the work of what historians do, and in the case of Uganda, where have we come from, and where are we today? So Karugire reflected on the things, and in a postscript in his Roots of Instability, which he wrote in March 1986, he expressed his optimism again, like he had done in the first book. He said, Mr. Museveni was sworn in as president of Uganda, promising the hundreds of thousands who attended the ceremony that the occasion did not represent just another change of guard, as on prior occasions for the previous regimes. Those familiar with Uganda's recent history will join most Ugandans in fervently praying that Mr. Museveni will be in a position to keep his promise to his countrymen. So that was in 1988. Of course, again, for those who don't know, Karugire's son marries Museveni's daughter. Of course, by the time I guess he was writing this, that was not there. And when we look at the situation in Uganda today, I don't know what Karugire would say about this. Again, about his optimism, because he had a sort of guarded optimism when Amin came to power, and again we see a similar thing here. Now, I think that I'm really running out of time, but I just want to quickly say that yes, we have Karugire right, we have Semakula right about that period, but in addition, of course, there are also works of Fires Mutibwa, Professor Kasozi, who also writes about the social violence in Uganda. So we sort of have that set of scholarship or historiography where the historians focus on the problems that had befallen post-independence Uganda. And within the history department, we also have scholarship coming up in which people look at the problems facing Uganda, but sort of associating these problems with external influence and not problems within Uganda itself. So that was the kind of state of history in the 90s. And then we have the neoliberal dispensation come in, and there's restricted, actually not restricted, in terms of funding graduate studies and even providing any forms of research to academics in the history department. There were no monies, sort of coming from the university or from the government to support to support research and graduate studies in history and other humanities disciplines, right from about 1996, I think. And so what happens is that people who are teaching in history could, you could teach, yes, if you wanted to do the research, the money wasn't there. But later on, the university supports some of the staff to go and do their PhD studies elsewhere. So a number of colleagues went to different universities and they were able to get their PhDs, and then they come back here. But because of the teaching load and really there is no money for research, people are very much restricted to teaching. And so in a sense, the department becomes a kind of service department or a teaching department, like Oliver had mentioned much earlier, and it sort of stays that way. So maybe just as I conclude, I would like to say, yes, that was the state, which not very optimistic. But then in the recent years, things have gotten a little better, because I think that the external funding agencies appreciate the history more than our own government here would do. So we have funding for graduate students in the college, and history has benefited from this a lot, from the Gerda Henkel funding in Germany. And so because they place emphasis on historical studies, it has supported many graduate students, including people being dragged to sort of think and try to do things historically, even when their background was not necessarily history. So for us, we feel like, yes, this is the moment. There are people who appreciate us, even if we are called useless here, but there are people who appreciate us, and we are trying our best to keep on the form. I hope that we can be able to move from the time when the emphasis was that historians of Africa can only be trained outside the continent, to actually show the world that historians can be trained at Makerere and be able to work in any part of the world. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for that fascinating discussion. For the interest of time, I'll just hand it directly over to our discussant, Dr. Machava. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me in what is, I think, becoming a sort of a household name as seminars go. And these COVID times, I congratulate you, Edgar, and your colleagues at Makerere for making this a very dynamic and well-attended seminar. So kudos to you. I've been given 5 minutes, so I'll keep my remarks brief. But I have to start by saying how much I really enjoyed reading your paper, Pamela, and how much I learned from it. It's a very, very rich and detailed work. And from reading it and hearing the presentation, it seems to me that the particular way in which African countries came to be landed history as a discipline, a particular role, not simply as a method of producing knowledge about the past, but as an instrument in the political struggles from which African countries were constituted. And historians have coined the term usable pasts to denote the ways in which academics and politicians in the 1950s and 60s sought to use the lessons from history to serve their partisan projects, chief among them nation building, which you mentioned quite well in the paper. But what they seem to fail to grasp is that it was not just the past or pasts that were usable, but history itself Therefore, the correct term should be, usable histories, precisely because the pasts that lended their usefulness to projects of nation building and others, of course, those were the ones that were usable. But history itself was here the instrument, and these were histories that were produced within temporal contexts that determined the historical genres and historical methods in use. So your paper, Pamela, gives us an excellent itinerary of this process in East Africa and at Makerere University, more particularly. And you distinguish here three temporal contexts in historical production that can be, and I think I can sum them in this way. One, an initial context of awakening in the early days of the 20th century, when African intellectuals and political entrepreneurs like Apollo Kagwa of Uganda or Samuel Johnson of Yoruba and West Africa realized that history has something to teach their contemporaries about their common sort of tribal ancestry, and demonstrate to their European conquerors that Africans had nations too. And I can, of course, add Kenyatta's Facing Mount Kenya in this lot. Historians have called these sort of early works homespun histories. A point I think I would like you to sort of expand in the paper. It would actually make the paper richer. There was a second context of discovery, I think, when in the 1950s and 60s, people realized that Africa had a history too. A realization that was both the product of European scholars like Roland Oliver, who in my view dominates the paper, and a few African pioneers like Zogwe and J. Fage. And they sort of spearheaded the liberal scholarship, which provided much of the ammunition for the nationalist historiography that dominated those years of struggles for decolonization and nation building. However, as you correctly point out, there were critical voices of the kind of histories produced in those days by a small African readership. The paper names a number of Ugandan, Kenyan, and Tanzanian intellectuals, and I wonder what expectations were there in the Ugandan and by extension Kenyan or Tanzanian publics about the histories being produced at this time. What sort of audiences these critics seek to reach? I also wonder if you have any critical points to offer about Oliver and his scholarship beyond what seems to be the sort of heroic picture that we get from the paper. If I'm not mistaken, your goal is not necessarily to write hagiography of Roland Oliver. And we finally land at the third context of post-colonial violence and rupture, in which history ceases to be a source of national pride and becomes a source of contention and division, viewed by politicians as an embarrassment, in your words, something to be avoided. So you seem to argue that although we are still in the grips of this context of mistrust of the historical craft, there has been a resurgence or sort of revitalization of the field in Uganda and Makerere in particular. So what is leading this resurgence? I wonder, does funding only account for it? And I also wonder whether has the current government lessened their guard on historians, or they're simply tired and or disinterested. What strikes me about Uganda, all I know about the country, is the lack of places or monuments of historical remembrance of its most recent history. Unlike countries like Mozambique or Kenya, for example, Uganda's, for example, Independence Day seems to arouse little public euphoria, and the glorious days of independence have no major celebrity symbols. So how is this to change with the new sort of resurgence of historical inquiry at Makerere, as you point out? And more importantly, perhaps, is what histories are being produced in this current context in Uganda. I'll stop here so we have more time for this wonderful audience that we have here to engage. Thank you.
Thanks so much for those really thought-provoking comments. I don't know, Pamela, if you want to respond to as many of those comments as you wish, and then we can open the floor. There are already questions coming in the chat, but maybe if you could address those ones first.
Okay. Thank you very much, Benedito, for your thank you very much for the comments, and I must say, really, largely comments and perhaps suggestions of things that I ought to reflect on. And as you may have noticed, towards the end of the paper, I really rushed because I realized that I've gone an hour and beyond, and I just need to collapse some of these things. So I think I'm not really answering to the questions that you've raised. I take them as comments, but I would like to in a sense, agree with you. One, that we kind of seem gagged, and we would rather write about other things and not the sensitive political things, because they'll get us in trouble. So that that is a fact. So sometimes even if it's just it's just a public talk and you mention certain things, I think that our colleague Moses, I don't know if he's here, would share his experience where even his mother would call him and say, now you write in the newspapers and you're criticizing the government, you're going to cause us a lot of problems. They might come for us. So that fear is that kind of fear is there, and it's real. I don't want to pretend about it. And so I don't know how we can get out of that, especially if we want to talk about it while we are here. But there are colleagues from other departments that sort of take that on in different ways. The point about some of the sort of emerging voices in terms, back in the 60s and sort of in the broader East African region, in terms of what people perhaps thought should constitute African history, it's something that as I'm working through this draft, I sort of have these questions to myself, saying, okay, so I need to see how, for example, debates in the Daily Nation in Kenya inform what happens at Makerere at that time. And I cannot put a finger on that right now, but it is something that I feel that I need to really address. And then, yes, the resurgence of history in Uganda, yes, and what kind of histories are being produced. So that's an interesting one. So from the 90s, I think, following the onset of the sort of the neoliberal policies, there was the whole question of, people should study topics that are relevant. Of course, relevant to who is another thing, but that pushed people to think about topics that might seem to fit within that whole notion of relevance. So if there's a way that somebody thought what they're going to study is going to inform policies, then this study will be able to inform policy in this way, and that will make it relevant. Or this study is going to focus on issues of national concern. So as people try to think about that, especially graduate students, then the kind of work that they started working on actually shifted from what kind of conventional history should be. So why are you doing the things of the colonial time? You know, that seems like so far. And why are you doing things of Africa's deep past? We want to talk about things that are relevant to us today. And so that what is relevant, if we talk about conflict resolution, maybe that is something that is relevant. So that's sort of trying to instrumentalize, you know, his historical knowledge did very much shape the kind of histories that even graduate students began to do. But, and here I think Edgar will agree with me, we are trying very much to, we are trying very much to you know, to encourage our students to try to push back as far as they can. Of course, the issue of the sources also, you know, pops up. Someone says, I want to do this, but how do I do it? I don't have the skills of doing ABCD. So it is something that I must say we are still grappling with. For example, we would want to push our students to use historical linguistics, and I'm very happy that Rhiannon joined us here. But none of us in the department has the skills to actually train students to use historical linguistics. So that is sort of the kind of struggle we need to think around it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We have a number of questions already and comments in the chat. I'm just going to go to each person as I see your comment or your virtual hand raised. But could I ask, I guess, either Pamela or William Musamba in the room to take questions from the room? Why don't we take one round of questions online, and then we can see if there are questions in the room, and then go back to online. So I'm just going in order that I've seen the comments. Dr. Alf Daniels Mabingo has a question about the etymology of African history. I don't know if you're able to unmute and ask your question, Dr. Mabingo.
Yes, thank you, Pamela, and thank you, Bendito. Just my question is concerning the concept African history, especially the etymological problems, because in Pamela's presentation, she has really mentioned it a lot. And I would love to just hear her thoughts about just the problematics of just that concept that might come off as too homogenizing than speak to the specifics of the histories that this continent has had. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I'm muted. Thank you for that. I think we'll take let's take two at a time and see how much time we have. The next question I saw in the chat was from David Cohen, who actually has a couple of questions about other thinking outside of the narrow confines of the department, about the East African Institute of Social Research, about Dar es Salaam, Dalhousie. I might add Michigan to that as well. David, would you like to ask your question? Although I don't know if you can hear us, but he has a question. He says, thinking aloud, wondering how to address the disconnection between historians at Makerere and those working, or those doing work of social history and behavioral politics at MISER, and at that time, East African Institute of Social Research, and problems of historians digesting anything that resembled anthropology. And then further down, he also adds to that, also thinking back to the 1970s, the roles of Dar es Salaam history and Dalhousie history being sort of Makerere history in exile, sort of like shadow departments. And I think Michigan also acted like that, having, I think at one time, you know, like almost the entire department, you know, dozens of former Makerereans employed at the University of Michigan in the 1980s. why don't we, just because I see such a volume of questions, I think we should take 3 at a time. And then, that way, hopefully we can get to as many as possible. The next I saw a hand from Dr. Doreen Kembabazi. I don't know if you'd like to unmute and.
Yes, thank you so much, Edgar, Pamela. This is a very timely paper. I couldn't miss it. I had to leave everything because I think it's important that we do talk about these things, because if some of you are on Twitter, you must have noticed that the first son is sort of involved in writing the Suez history to legitimize the rule. So we have to talk about these things. But I also noticed that some people do have questions for us scholars. One in particular, Jim Sentong, the famous cartoonist, wrote, and I'm going to quote here, "We have turned into a selfish class that is comfortable with its financial privileges, playing into the international scholarly traditions of self-importance and carefully avoiding popular media." He was referring to academics' indifference to basically what's going on, the fact that we're ignoring this rewriting of history. Now, I wonder from your talk, Dr. Khanakwa, what do you have to say about our role as historians in perpetuating what is going on today? The government we know is undermining humanities, but there seems to be something else going on in that we historians are, might be afraid or indifferent maybe to actually make a case for humanities. And the fact that a lot of us came to this conference shows that indeed we do recognize that there is a problem. But what else can we do really, to make sure that we stand up for history, which is obviously being used by, the first hand to legitimize their role? So that's my question. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So let's take those sort of that set of questions and respond to as many as you feel able to, and then we'll take another round.
Or maybe just, thank you very much, Doreen. Hi. It's good to have you here. And of course, Professor Cohen, I'm very humbled to have you listening to this very long talk. I really appreciate you joining us. Alpha Daniels, Mavingo, the concept of African history. I think so you say what are the problems, or isn't this homogenizing? Yes, I think yes, African history as a discipline, but when we study African history, we really know that they are specifics. Nobody can claim to write, it's sort of like a totality of African history. You might want to argue that there's nothing like African history, but African histories, or the kind of thing that you'd speak about culture, is there anything like African culture or the African cultures? So I think that yes, as a field of study, we have African history, but under this African history, really, the breakdowns are there, paying very specific attention to specific things. So there are really many strands within this whole big notion of African history. Even if you talk about the social history, you'll find that under that there's so many other things. So yes, the sort of blanket categories homogenizing, but under that we have, they're very specific things. I don't know if I answer your question, but that's what I would say. And the comments from Professor David Cohen, I think these are very critical pointers, and I recognize that I don't pay attention to all this, especially the East African Institute of Social Research in the 1940s that specifically started focusing on writing about the, I think they call them the native or the indigenous people. Of course, there's the whole history leading to the formation of the East African Institute of Social Research. So it is, I agree that it's important. I think in the paper, I'll try to sort of see the link between what was happening in the history department and how that might connect to MISA, and especially at the time when we have, I think in the 70s, there are actually a number of colleagues from the history department that went on to become directors, executive directors at the Makerere Institute of Social Research. So there's that connection that I need to draw out clearly. And the other universities, I mean, there are many. Again, you'll realize, of course, I mentioned Northwestern, for example, but there's a lot more in terms of when I read the departmental archives in terms of correspondence between John Roy and others and what was happening here. There's a lot happening between, or that was happening, or sort of giving a linkage between the history department here and this and the many other universities. So I take note of that, and I'll try to address it. And then Doreen, of course, thank you very much. I don't know whether the cartoonist is actually my colleague. He's the head of the Department of Philosophy here, Dr. James Pius Ntonga. So it's good to hear you comment about his cartoons. I don't know if he's joined us or not, but yeah, back to the question. I mean, as I did mention earlier, it is we. As historians, right, and maybe not just historians, but the part of the elite in the country and all that, I think we need to stand up to some of these things, in terms of the political leadership, but. Is something that I cannot answer. And we're having a discussion here with our college leadership. Some advice that I took personally very seriously is that, well, we cannot stop those who are saying what they want to say, but we should do our part to demonstrate that we are actually able to do certain things. So let's do this by doing and not necessarily engaging in is a sort of direct or confrontational debate with them. And then, of course, this perhaps also goes along with the question of, again, as historians, as academics, whether we are not perpetuating the not very good things here. And I just, again, want to say the same. I think that sometimes your location might also determine, might also influence what you're able to say and what you're not able to say, or even the sort of means or mechanisms that you use to say what you want, what you want to say. And so that's why earlier in my response to Benedita, I said we are kind of gagged. How we break out of these chains, I think takes a lot of courage, and attention to sort of the court traditions, which would, it was not advisable to privilege those at the expense of, traditions that might be contained by the rest of the population. And I think this was kind of going against what Oliver had suggested earlier, that, for the very organized societies, they had, this information organized and stored in a particular manner. I have to read Bethel Ogot a little bit more clearly so that I can put my fingers on what, on how he might have deviated from Roland Oliver. But I know that one of the big questions that he raised in the 60s, while other African intellectuals in the region were calling for the sort of Africanization of the curriculum, he was also saying that there was need to pay attention to what was called European or world history, that what was happening was actually a form of British history that was erroneously being referred to as world history. And so he wanted that distinction that, British history is not world history, and this should be made very, very clear. About the Senate decision in 1971, actually, this is something that I'm still trying to find out. I do not have an answer. I do not know why they were not comfortable with with African history. So I'm trying to see if I can access the record or the records of that discussion. Then I think I should be in a better position to answer that. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. Jack, I don't know how much time do we have. There are two interesting questions in the audience.
Okay, I think I don't have the chat because my connection came in after they were posted. So if I don't know if you're able to moderate those questions. And also, we can't see the audience in the room, but if I don't know some questions.
Yes, we have some people who want to ask questions. I don't know why from here.
Yes, I do.
Yes, please, Professor Adesina.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I had one of the chats in the chat box, but let me also ask the question directly now. Congratulations, Pamela, on this wonderful presentation. And I am fascinated by all the things you have done, looking at the history of history in Eastern Africa. My question, the first question I want to ask is, what was the role of public opinion in the life and career of history as a discipline? Have you been able to track what the civil society, administration, opinion, holders in newspapers, what did they say about this field? Because
it's very exciting on my part to actually have you join us here, especially given the Makerere Ibadan connection. Colleagues, Professor Adesina is a professor of history at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, and we've known each other for a while, so it's very nice to have him here. So I think I'll begin with the last question. which is more really of a suggestion in terms of the neglected themes. And yes, as I think I can think through that. Very quickly, already I'm thinking about the history of Uganda project introduced by Webster in 1949, and the kind of histories that project focused on, which were essentially sort of tribal histories and focusing on centralized societies. And then on the period before that, I, for example, made reference to Kiwanuka's writings about sort of revisiting the history of Bunyoro Kitara. Now, one of the things that I did not mention, and this is the problem of wanting to say so many things within a short span of time, is that by the late 1960s, the government of Obote, or President Obote specifically, was not I think very comfortable with the kind of history that was being written. And so one of the things that the Obote government did was to restrict archival research. And this was important because with the restrictions on archival research, it meant that those seeking to do history in Uganda would not easily access archival sources. And so we see a more push into the distant past, where people are largely relying on oral traditions. And again, I'm happy that Professor David Cohen is here, because again, that's about the time when he was actually in Uganda, and he can correct me on this. And then when it comes to the Amin period, the restrictions, there are further restrictions on research. And this time it is not just archival research, but actually people going to the field and running oral interviews. So there are parts of the country like Kigezi, for example, where there was a clear ban on research in that area. And if people who are doing research in that area at that point had to be recalled. And then there are also parts of northern Uganda. So I think that Professor, yes, if I work through what was going on in those topics and in terms of what is neglected, and access the Senate records, I should be able to answer that question. Thank you very much. The role of public opinion in the field of African history. Yes, I mean, certainly I think the public opinion played a role, although I have not carefully sort of kept track of how debates in the public sphere might have influenced what happened or what took place at certain times. But again, just looking at the example of the 60s, in the case of Uganda, again, when you have this controversy over the lost counties, which was quite volatile. And then in 1966, you have the central government invade the Kabaka's parliament in Uganda Kingdom, and what follows after that. I think that these were critical moments when the idea of a reusable past becomes very critical, and I'm persuaded that this did inform some of the scholarship emerging at that time. So yes, I need to pay again more close attention to that and see how much I can be able to track in terms of what is coming from public opinion. Thank you.
So I wonder, with everyone's indulgence, if we could just stay on for 10 or so more minutes, because there's so many. This is such a great discussion, and there are so many questions. I would just add that in 2 weeks, Professor Adesina will be presenting in the seminar on a similar topic about the history of history at the University of Ibadan. So this is a really exciting set of discussions. Could we take some questions from the room? I don't know if Pamela, if you're able to moderate, or William, and just for the benefit of us, if people could introduce themselves so we know who's speaking. And I think you're muted.
William will do that.
Great, thanks.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Taylor.
We have a few hands raised here in the room. I think we can yes, let us start with Professor Susan.
We're not hearing very well. I don't know if I think the chair has to be unmuted. Pamela, I think if you unmute your microphone, and then members can speak into the. Hello, hello. Sorry, I think you're still muted.
No, I thought it wasn't. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you. Welcome.
My name is Susan Chiguli, and from the Department of Literature. So maybe it is fitting that someone who is really not in the field, and a naive observer starts from this room, starts to ask questions. Just to say thank you very much, Pam, for this presentation, especially your being able to talk about the early concerns of decolonization, because with the recent decolonization drive, people tend to pretend that there were no efforts before. And this is not only from the history field, but I can speak for the literary field. Okot Pabitek was very vocal in the 1960s and 50s on decolonization of the curriculum, but it's like those efforts are not recognized. What is even more worrying is these things are documented. It's not like he spoke and didn't write down. I'm just giving an example of Okot Pabitek, but when you mentioned when I had the paper, I saw that your paper does at least highlight this drive. So maybe we will be able to talk with a little more broadly about this. My question is a question that was already raised by your discussant, but I'm quite, as an outsider, I'm quite concerned on this. You mentioned Roland Oliver as a go-between or a crusader for African history, an early crusader for African history. But what are the implications? Because it seems to be quite a dominant figure in your paper and in the in starting up research and writing and debates in African history. What are the implications of this patronage of Roland Oliver in thinking about Ugandan history, East African history, African history? Of course, I was concerned, I'm very interested in your thinking also on Mavingo's, Alpha Daniels Mavingo's concern of this African history suitcase that we have, and just highlighting that there are other regional histories may not be enough, but that is a question for another day. I just also wanted to comment, Pam, that there is, Mrs. Joyce Mpanga has written an autobiography that was launched in 2020, or 2019, I forget. It's a pity she's not a boy. And in it, she talks about the fact that she was an African student here, and she talks a lot. She's African history. She was a history student. History student. I apologize for that. History student. So I was just thinking that since she's alive and her autobiography is available, it may be interesting to either read the autobiography and maybe have a talk with her. But if that is not possible, at least have some interest someone else in talking to her, because it's interesting to have these voices. I mean, she didn't write with these questions in mind, so it may be interesting to have these questions put to her to see what she says as a student from history at that time. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Susan. Well, let us also, I think, let's take a comment or question from Dr. Utabajuka, and then you respond at once.
Thank you very much, the moderator and the organizers, and thank you so much, Dr. Khanakwa, for this amazing piece of research and very fluent presentation.
I think we've lost the audio. I think you need to stay unmuted for the chair.
Okay. I don't know. The echo again.
I think, William, you need to mute your audio, and then we'll just get the audio from the chair's computer. If chair can unmute, yeah.
Is it okay now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Someone asked a question about the role of public opinion in the development of historical research and the curriculum at Makerere. And I thought that that question would be pushed back a little bit to maybe ask about the broad concerns, the broad issues and social forces, socio-economic political forces that were at work at the time, one of which I think is nationalism and the role of nationalists. I wonder what role they played, but also how that momentum got exhausted to a point where we have Professor Kasozi writing his tome on social origins of violence in Uganda, and Professor Karujire writing on roots of instability in Uganda, and what their concerns are at this point as historians. I also want to alert you that Professor Karujire gave an inaugural lecture in 1986 entitled Wind of Change or Mere Change in the Wind, which I wish you can get hold of and see whether it has connections with this book, Roots of Instability in Uganda. And then to also try to go back a little bit and see these tribal histories, whether they were connected with the question of nationalism, whether the authors of these works thought that tribal communities, whether centralized or decentralized, were building blocks for a larger nation, for the nations. And probably at that point, you would want to interrogate the concept of national unity, which was in vogue at the time. And I've also been wondering whether it is actually a scholarly term. Maybe you can help us interrogate it and exhaust its content. Thank you.
I think so far those are the only questions that we have got from the audience here. May I request Dr. Pamela to respond? Thank you.
Thank you very much, again, colleagues. Susan, thank you very much for again coming to sit in to listen to my presentation. I really appreciate, can't take that for granted. Okay, so I mean, some of the the comments. I appreciate the point about the point about reading the autobiography of Joyce Mpanga. I need to do that, and of course, as you said, Oliver Roland is everywhere. In my paper, part of the reason being that I have only recently read his autobiography. So and so I found so many things that many people might have known, but I didn't know that myself until I read his autobiography. I was like, wow, this is very enlightening. And so you say what are the implications of this sort of patronage, looking at Oliver as somebody who was a big crusader of the field of African history. And I think really importantly, getting his stance on what departments of history on the African continent would be able to do or not to do, and what would be done in the universities in the metropole. So I think, yes, of course, the implications for this, yes, so the patronage is there, yes, and I really must say that for a long time, again, not just because of Roland Oliver, but because of the realities at Makerere, for example, most of the PhD training, or most of the people with PhDs had to study elsewhere. And largely because of, the conditions here as well. And so I think that we are at a point, how I wish Roland Oliver lived much longer. I think you'd get to a point where we realize that, yes, this historical knowledge production and the training of historians can actually be done in Africa as well, and that we have started to do that. So I think in his times, yeah, this that was the reality, and I think that it's really complex because of complex forces, both here and out there. But I think that this is something that slowly. I think that we are navigating around this, and therefore looking forward to more collaborations in different ways, support from our colleagues in the north who have access to better resources and facilities, be able to work with them, but also try to have our home grown sort of historian. So again, I don't know if I answer your question, but those would be my thoughts for now. Dr. Rutabajuka, thank you very much. You always ask me very fascinating questions. I've basically walked this project with you from the very initial stages. So it's been a journey, and you really raise critical questions, and I need what I can say is really I need to think through this, especially the question of where the momentum gets exhausted. I think that is extremely important in the early period, like in the post-independence period to the early 70s. I think that might be understood where the momentum sort of gets exhausted because of sort of the prevailing circumstances, both at the university, but I mean, at national level, politically. But then come this other phase where we have these histories of Karugire, Kasozi, Fayez Mtibwa, writing about very critical issues that had befallen Uganda. And so again, where did that momentum end? I mean, one of the things I can say, for example, Professor Mtibwa is a director of the Military Training Academy in Jinja. So right now, I don't know if he can, having that position, and maybe this also could speak to Doreen's earlier question, whether he can now be able to write the kind of stuff that he wrote when he was writing Uganda since independence, and when he was giving the experience, writing as somebody who had lost several family members during the NRA war in Luwero. So there are also these things that one really needs to pay attention to. I will look for the inaugural lecture of Karugire. I hope I can get my hands on it. Now, the tribal histories notion, actually this concept of tribal histories began from SOAS. And that's when they were talking about hiring young graduates to go to work in sort of specific or designated areas. They talked about tribal histories, and so and so I see in the 60s when Kiwanuka, for example, makes the recommendation that perhaps focusing on tribal histories is the way to go. And again, Professor Kiwanuka himself, having been at SOAS, I think there's something there, and perhaps, I mean, I have had that discussion with him, but I should talk to him a little bit more to get his sense of what he, as academics at Makerere in the 60s, when they're talking about tribal histories, what exactly is it? What did they hope to achieve? Yes, I think those are the ones that I'm able to respond to. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that. I don't, because I've been my connection was off. I'm not sure if I'm missing anyone in the chat or online. Please raise your hand if you have the last question for this round. But I think I would just, in case anyone does, and to give them time, I'll use my chair to add one more question / comment, just to point out that, you know, this concern that I think Dr. Kembabazi and in a different way Dr. Rutabajuka raised about kind of a, you know, and I think in your paper you're in some ways Kenneth Ingham, when you're writing about Kenneth Ingham and about Roland Oliver, it's almost as if you're writing about the colonial government and the Carnegie Foundation in some way. I mean, they the part of the institutional momentum that they bring to history comes from those places. And that, you know, I think that kind of problematizes our sense that, well, the professionalization of African history was somehow something to be defended from the influence of politics or the state, because it's always been enmeshed in, those two have always been enmeshed together. I mean, Kenneth Ingham's history, I forget, was it History of Modern Uganda or History of Uganda, was essentially commissioned by the colonial government. I mean, he sent his manuscript there were line edits from Governor Cohen dictated to J.V. Wild. He was given access to secret files, you know. Then David Apter, his manuscript was also commented on by, I think, by Wild. I have to check my notes. So, I mean, there's always been this kind of, you know, relationship, but also, you know, effort to keep a distance, but also to be relevant and embedded in those dynamics. And so I wonder if, to what extent if we think about sort of more recent, whether, you know, post 1986, or I would say, you know, maybe post 1980, you know, relationship of history to, you know, more contemporary political dynamics. To what extent are those sort of more a continuation of the dynamics set in place at the founding of history, of the academic study of history in Uganda in the 1950s? I mean, is it useful to think about these dynamics? Often I feel like the dynamics of say after Amin's time are disconnected historically from what happens earlier, as if there was a glory day of historical knowledge production, and since then there's been a kind of separate set of dynamics related to you know, more mundane issues of politics and so on. But I wonder how can we think about the 1950s, sort of rethink the history of the 1950s and 1960s, and these shuttling between colonial archives, between the Rockefeller Foundation, as being sort of the way that, you know, and I think it goes back to David Chimba's question about how people like Bethwell Ogot and Karojire and Chiwanuka navigated between these kind of dynamics of colonial sort of people, mentors or elders in the department who were embedded in the colonial establishment, and those who were kind of embedded in an emerging global professionalization of the field with networks in New York and London and so on. I don't know if that was sort of clear, but it sort of came to mind. If anyone has I realize I just thank everyone for staying with us for so long. If anyone has a final question, we can add it here before Dr. Khanakwa gives us her last comments. Maybe if you want to just, I don't know if you want to say anything about that, or just if any final thoughts on the discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Edgar, for this comment, and of course also being able to sort of, I mean, pinpoint things that perhaps I I hadn't paid attention to in the paper. I think I don't really have an answer now in terms of whether what we see in the post-1980s is a continuation of what had happened in the 1950s. But I think that, well, it is something that I can think about. But of course, the sort of what seems clear is yes, the effort to protect history from maybe political leadership was there early, but also the political leadership was supportive of the project in the 50s. And so when we come to the 80s plus, or even 86 specifically, and move to where we are today, where it is the political leadership being dismissive of what historians do, but at the same time using history to justify certain things that they do. And again, like Doreen highlighted, having the first son, I promise that he's going to rewrite history. I think so. There's a lot going on. There's a lot going on around there, and I think I need to think about that a little closely so that I can come up with a more nuanced explanation. So my last thoughts would be, first of all, to really thank the Andrew Mellon Foundation for supporting this research. And also, and of course, to thank all of you, to thank everybody for your time, for your patience, to thank Bendito for having to struggle to read through a very disjointed paper. Yeah, really to just thank all of you. I'm very, very humbled that you've given me such an audience. Thank you very much. And of course to you, Edgar, for organizing, and William for coordinating here. I think I didn't give William a very easy time, but we managed to pull through. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was really fascinating and timely and rich discussion. And thank you to everyone who stayed with us through, even though we're well beyond our allocated time. So thank you very much. I just add, I'm going to just share the schedule on the screen here. We, as I mentioned, in 2 weeks, we have Professor Adesina will be presenting Beyond Imperial Eyes, Ibadan School of History and the Crossroads of Knowledge. And Dr. Khanakwa will be back as the discussant for that paper. So I think really, that may be sort of a continuation of many of the themes in a different context. So please join us for that paper as well. And then just for those, maybe everyone I think in the room and in the university is aware, but for those outside, just to know that the College of Humanities and Social Sciences is hosting a International Humanities Conference at the end of August. So please stay, obviously if you're in Kampala, please make it's going to be a great occasion, so please make an effort to attend. We'll see if, I think it may be available online, in hybrid form as well. And we have a series of other papers as well coming in September by Henri Medard, Michael De Haas, and then by our head of department, Dr. Charlotte Mafumbo, who will be giving a paper at the end of September on rescuers, the uncelebrated and unsung heroes of the civil war in northern Uganda. So please, I hope everyone can join us for some of those events as well. So just thanks everyone for joining us.